One of the predominant features of Minoan art is going to be frescoes, which gives me a great chance to explain exactly what frescoes are, a little bit about their history, and the types of frescoes that we generally deal with. First of all, what is fresco painting? Well, fresco painting is painting on wet plaster. There's an advantage to this, which is that it becomes more or less indestructible. Obviously, you can smash it with a hammer, but no matter how much you wash it, especially painting on wet plaster, it's not going to come off. So a fresco is a painting done rapidly in watercolor on wet plaster on a wall or ceiling. Now, this definition says that the color penetrates the plaster. That's not the entire story, but it's close enough for the moment. And the reason you have to paint it on wet plaster is you want that paint to become part of the plaster. As soon as it dries, you no longer get the same effect. It sits on the surface. You need to add a binder to glue that pigment to the surface. And so there's a certain element of, permanence. And you can imagine someone plastering, say, the walls of the palace at Knossos, and they spill the wine that they're drinking at the time. It splashes across the wall, and they realize that they can't wash it off once the plaster is dry. Well, this may have driven the workmen crazy, but it may also have given them an idea, which is to add paint to it, to paint over the surface while the plaster is wet. And the timing is important here. You would only have between 3 and 4, maybe as many as 6 hours to paint, and then you have to scrape away everything you haven't painted. As you see here, he's replastering to do more painting around that mural. You have to scrape away everything and then replaster anywhere that you intend to paint the next day, which is called a giornale, those stages that we see in fresco. So when we look at a cross section, this really explains what happens. We have the support, which is the wall. We have a rough plaster coat, and then we have a fine plaster coat, and then the paint is applied to it. And so here we're at the paint layer right here. Now, what has happened is the lime in the plaster that the paint is applied to has been aged. It's been deacidified. They will leave it for 4 to 10 years. And what happens is they put the lime into fresh water, and the first time you do it, it almost boils with the acidity. And then they pour off that water every other day, and they replace it with new water, thus removing the acidity from the lime. Now, the lime doesn't like existing in that state. So as it dries, it takes carbon from the air. It creates carbonic acid crystals across its surface as it dries. And this is what essentially seals the paint to the surface. It's invisible. It's microscopic, and yet it is the key to true fresco. And there are different types of fresco that we see on a regular basis. The most common, the one that we usually refer to as fresco, is buon fresco. This is painting on wet plaster. So this is where that carbonic acid will form. This is where they're aging the lime. They're doing all the things, and this will be very, very permanent. You can scrub this with a sponge all day long. It doesn't matter. Nothing's going to happen to it. It will be impacted by water damaging the plaster, a hammer or something like that, or fire damaging the plaster. But really, as long as the plaster holds together, the paint will be there. Then we have fresco al secco. This is what we saw the Egyptians using. And this is where pigment is mixed with a binder and applied to dry plaster. The benefit of this is there's no time limit. I can take a lot of time. I can do a lot of detail. The downside of this is that the paint will eventually peel, especially if the binders aren't good over time. And of course, no one thinks about, is my binder going to be good in 2,000 years? By the way, fresco, if we go back to buon fresco for a second, this is classical Renaissance fresco, classical Greek fresco, Roman fresco. The Sistine Chapel ceiling is buon fresco. Al secco is only used by the Egyptians, some ancient peoples. Occasionally it's used in Rome, but it's fairly rare. And then mezzo fresco is when the plaster is almost but not quite dry, so the pigment is only slightly absorbed or slightly sealed. This becomes increasingly popular and almost replaces bone fresco entirely by the beginning of the 17th century. Basically, what they're doing is they're determining that the plaster can get much drier before they call off the painting for the day. This technique is used a lot when you see religious paintings where the background is red. You see this in the Renaissance a lot. And what they would do is they would leave that part to dry and they would paint the rest of it in bone fresco. And then that part they would apply lapis to. And lapis is an interesting material, interesting pigment when you grind that stone down, because it's not water soluble, so it has to have a binder, and so frequently they will use mezzofresco for that, but it's not a term you'll come across a lot. I'm just sort of throwing it out there as there is this halfway point. In terms of the history of fresco, among the first peoples to do it, of course, are the Egyptians. They're plastering the walls and painting them. You could argue that even the murals we saw at Catalhoyuk were forms of fresco al secco. It's the Minoans who will develop bone fresco, who will develop the painting in wet plaster, which is why these pieces survive. Oftentimes you see them in fragments. The plaster literally fell off the wall and was buried, and so we can pick up the pieces of plaster and piece them back together to create, well, at least reconstruct the mural as it existed at one time. So it speaks to the permanence of fresco and why people did it. It falls out of style after the Renaissance because of the development of oil paint. Oil paint, of course, allowing for very long drying times and allowing people to go back and work days and weeks later on the same passage in a painting. So it doesn't have the time limits that fresco does. But fresco really required an artist to be very confident, very sure, and very accurate. Because if you made a mistake, you just have to scrape the plaster and start over. There is no erasing it. And it has a strict time limit. In fact, that's part of why the Italian Renaissance includes so many nudes, because it's much easier to depict a nude in fresco than it is to depict a clothed figure, because the clothing has texture and things they're going to take a great deal to try and capture in fresco. It's very, very difficult to work with there.